3 years after I buried my son, I was still blaming God for everything. Not in the loud way, not with arguments or theology. In the quiet way that is more final than anything spoken. The way you close a door and push a piece of furniture against it and walk to the other end of the house. I had not prayed since the funeral. I had not set foot inside a church. I had not used the word God except as profanity. And even then, carefully, in private. Because I knew what it cost, and I was willing to pay it. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 55 years old. I drive a Greyhound route through the mountains of western North Carolina, the stretch of I-40 that climbs into the Smokies and then drops into Tennessee. 11 years on that same route. I've driven it in fog, in ice, in the kind of November snow that appears without warning and changes everything. I know every grade, every curve, every mile marker. Before I tell you what happened on that mountain in January, I need you to understand who I was, because what found me there couldn't have reached me any other way. Before we go further, leave a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this is reaching. I did 12 years in the Army, 2 deployments to Iraq, the second one in Anbar province in 2004, when the war had gone in a direction nobody had briefed us on. I was in combat logistics, convoys, forward positions, the interior of operations that don't appear in official accounts, but that stay in the bodies of the men who were part of them. The Army gave me something I've never been able to fully name, but can describe in its effects, the ability to function under pressure, to manage fear, to convert overwhelming circumstance into a sequence of solvable problems. I was good at this. My unit trusted me. What the Army also gave me was the skill of deferring processing. You need that in combat. The problem is the processing still has to happen eventually, and the men who are best at deferring tend to be the worst at eventually. I came home in 2006 with a back injury from a vehicle blast and a quality of watchfulness that never fully left me. I jump at certain sounds still. I drive with a specific attention to the road edges, to what's stationary versus what's moving, to the pattern of how people stand and whether their weight is shifted toward you or away. You come back from combat with a nervous system that doesn't fully relearn civilian rhythms. My therapist at the VA told me that once. I said I didn't have a therapist at the VA. He said I should. I didn't go. The Army also gave me something else that I didn't know was a problem until it was too late. The skill of deferring processing, putting things somewhere when you can't deal with them in the moment. You need that in combat. If you stopped and processed everything you witnessed, you couldn't function. The problem is, the processing still has to happen eventually. The men who are best at deferring tend to be the worst at eventually. I married Karen, who had waited through both deployments with the patient-specific love of someone who has chosen a complicated person and is not going to be talked out of it. She was the best person I have ever known. The center of gravity in our home. Not because I was absent or uninvested, but because Karen had a quality of presence that organized the space around it. She had a faith that I had always respected from a distance, Mass on Sundays, a Bible group on Tuesday evenings, a quality of daily prayer that was just present in the rhythm of the house, in how she started her mornings, in what she reached for when things got heavy. I bowed my head at grace. I drove her to Mass and waited in the car. She never required more than that from me, which I had always appreciated. Her faith didn't make demands. Until Marcus died. Then her faith became the only door still open in her. I couldn't understand that. I think not being able to understand it was part of what drove us apart. She was the best person I have ever known. The center of gravity in our home. The one who knew every teacher's name. Every practice schedule, every friend Marcus mentioned more than twice. When I came home from a difficult run, she didn't ask questions. She just sat in the kitchen with me because she knew when presence is the thing and questions are not. We had been genuinely happy. Not performed happiness, the working, practical happiness of two people who are good together in the ways that matter for the long run. We argued sometimes, but we were good at repair. When something broke, we fixed it. Our son Marcus was born in 2007, the year I started driving buses. I want to give him more than a sentence because he was more than a sentence. He was a specific person. He had my build and Karen's smile and a quality of attentiveness that made people feel he was genuinely interested in them, because he was. When you talked to Marcus, he looked at you, not through you, at you. He remembered what you said. He brought it back weeks later in a way that let you know he had been thinking about it. He played guitar badly and enthusiastically and was getting better. He was interested in how things worked, engines, electrical systems, the logic of structures. He had been accepted to an engineering summer program at NC State. He had a best friend named Cody who lives 3 streets over and still brings flowers to his grave on Marcus's birthday every year. I pass him there sometimes when I go myself. Marcus was the best thing Karen and I ever did together. And losing him is the thing that broke everything else. Our son Marcus was born in 2007. He was the kind of person that makes you understand why the word gift exists. He had my build and Karen's smile and a quality of straightforward warmth that made people around him feel more at ease than they had been before he arrived. He played guitar badly and enthusiastically and was getting better. He had been accepted to an engineering summer program at NC State. He had a best friend named Cody who still brings flowers to his grave on Marcus's birthday every year. Marcus died in the spring of his junior year of high school, an overdose. Fentanyl that had been mixed into something he wasn't even supposed to be taking, at a party at 16 years old, on a Friday night that I had sent him to without any anxiety, because I had sent him to 100 nights like it, and he always came home. He didn't come home. The police were at my door at 11 at night. There is a specific physical experience of receiving that news that I have thought about many times since, because I think it matters for understanding what the following 3 years were about. The information arrived in my body before it arrived in my mind. I was at the door, and there were 2 officers, and I knew before they said a word, because of the way they were standing, and the expression they were wearing, and the time of night. My body knew. My legs went unsteady before I had consciously processed what was happening. Then they told me, and then my mind knew too. I am not going to describe what came after that in detail. I will tell you that Karen was there, and that we held each other in the hallway for a long time before either of us could move, and that what she said in that hallway in the middle of the holding was the most honest thing I have ever heard her say. She said, "God, I don't understand this. I don't understand this at all. But you're here, and we're here, and I'm not going anywhere." I heard her say that. I also, somewhere in the months that followed, decided that I did not believe it. I decided that whatever was happening to us was not something I could afford to believe was accompanied by a God who was there and not going anywhere. Because if he was there and not going anywhere, then he was also there when Marcus made the choice he made at that party on that Friday night. And I was not prepared to have a God who was present for that and let it happen anyway. The door closed. The police were at my door at 11 at night. I want to tell you about the year that followed, because it is the soil everything else grew out of. The first weeks were surrounded by people, the casseroles and the cards and the neighbors who came and sat, and didn't know what to say but came anyway. Then they went back to their lives, because lives continue. And Karen and I were alone in a house with a boy's bedroom, whose door neither of us could open. His guitar was in there. His books were in there. The NC State brochure for the summer engineering program he had been accepted to was on his desk. I went back to driving in 6 weeks because I didn't know what else to do with my body. The route ran. The miles accumulated. I came home and sat in the kitchen. Karen sat in the living room. We spoke about the necessary things, the logistics of a shared household, the practical language of 2 people who have lost the deeper language they used to speak together. We tried. What ended it wasn't a single event. It was the accumulated weight of 2 people grieving in ways that were not compatible. Her grief opened her to prayer, to the church, to conversations with people she trusted about what she was feeling. My grief closed. That's the only way I know to say it. Hers opened and mine closed, and the distance between those 2 directions, maintained over 8 months, became the shape of our separation. I was not angry at Karen. Not then, not now. She was the sanest person in that house during those months. Her leaving was the rational response to an irrational situation. She could not stay in a house with a man who had decided that God was the enemy and that she was wrong to keep talking to him. I watched her drive away and felt the specific loneliness of someone who has lost a child and then lost the person who understood what that meant. She had a faith that sustained her through it. I had a wall. She asked me once, near the end of 8 months of trying, to pray with her, just once. She said, "I need to pray with you, and I need you to be there in it." I said, "I can't pray to someone who took our son." That was the conversation that told us both where we were. She moved to her sister's house in Asheville. We divorced without cruelty, which is its own kind of grief. I watched her drive away, and it was the loneliest I had ever been, including everything in Iraq. Because in Iraq, the loneliness had a shape and an end date. This had neither. I kept driving. The route was the only thing that made sense. Not because it brought comfort, because it required exactly enough concentration that the other thoughts couldn't fully occupy the foreground. Mountain routes especially, attention or consequence, there was a clarity in that I couldn't find anywhere else. I was also drinking. I want to say this directly because the honest account includes it. Not on the job, I was tested regularly and always clean, and my performance behind the wheel was never affected. But at night and on my days off, alone in the apartment in Waynesville, there was a bottle, and a specific number of glasses beyond which the sound of the door at 11 o'clock, the police on the porch, Karen's face, beyond which those things receded to a manageable distance. It worked, in a narrow technical sense. It did what I was asking it to do. The problem was that the processing I needed to do was still not happening, and was accumulating, and the accommodation I had built for it was expensive in ways I could account for, and ways I couldn't. I knew this wasn't sustainable. I knew it in the way you know things you're not prepared to act on yet. I was 53 years old, and I was waiting for something to change without knowing what. I did not know, on that January morning, that the change was standing in a rest stop parking lot with a pack on one shoulder. I was also drinking, not visibly, not on the job. I was tested regularly and always clean, but at night and on my days off, alone in the apartment in Waynesville, with the systematic quality of someone who has identified a mechanism that interrupts the thing they cannot otherwise interrupt. And I did not like homeless men. I want to say this plainly because it's the honest account, and because I say it plainly now, with the willingness of someone who has thought about an ugly thing long enough to understand what it was and why. On any given run through the cities on my route, Asheville, Knoxville, the stops in between, I passed men on the streets, in doorways, outside the shelter on Charlotte Street in Asheville. I had driven past 100 times. I looked through them, not aggressively. Not with the active contempt of a man who has decided he hates a person. With the specific non-seeing of someone who has assigned something to a category that requires nothing of them. I built that category out of what had happened to Marcus. Every man I saw with nothing reminded me of the epidemic. I had decided the epidemic had a face, the face of the lost, the face of the man who chose this, because the alternative was accepting that Marcus hadn't chosen anything, that he had simply been in a normal place on a normal night, and had been killed by something invisible that had been put there without his knowledge. If I accepted that, there was no perpetrator. There was no face to aim the anger at. There was just an accident, a random terrible thing that could not have been predicted or prevented that happened to my son on a Friday night. I could not accept that. It was too large to absorb without something to push against. So I pushed against every face that reminded me of the epidemic, which meant I pushed against the men who were most like the face of it in my mind, which were the men without anything, the men on the streets, the men at rest stops in snowstorms who raised their hand and asked for a ride. I was wrong about every part of this. I know that now. I did not like homeless men. Every man I saw on the street with nothing reminded me of Marcus, not literally, because of the fentanyl, because of the epidemic that had taken my son, and that I needed to have a face. I had decided that face was a choice rather than a disease, because accepting it as a disease would have required accepting that what happened to Marcus was something other than preventable. I needed the anger aimed somewhere. I aimed it at the lost. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I knew it partly even then, in the place where honest knowledge lives that you don't always let reach the surface. But knowing something and living by it are different operations, and I was running on a fuel that wasn't interested in the kind of honesty that required revision. Then January came. On that morning I was driving the 615 out of Asheville. I had been up since 4:30, gas station coffee in the thermos, half empty before we left the station. The specific pre-dawn quality of a January morning in the mountains. The world not yet gray, still dark. The kind of dark that has a specific weight in winter. I want to tell you something about the mountain route that I have only understood since that January, though it was true all along. 11 years I had been driving this same stretch of I-40 through the Smokies. Same grades, same curves, same mile markers, every kind of weather. The mountain does not get easier as a route. It gets more known. You develop a relationship with it that is partly technical and partly something else. A familiarity that is not comfort because the mountain can still kill you, but a familiarity that is respect. You know what it is, and it knows you've been there before. What I had come to depend on, in the 3 years after Marcus died, was the specific quality of attention that the mountain requires in bad weather. When the road is white, and the visibility is down to your headlights, and the grade is working against you, you cannot think about anything else. Your entire nervous system is in the job. There is no room for the other thing. The mountain had become my medication. Bad weather was a gift, because it asked everything of me and left no space for the rest. I had driven through several storms in those 3 years that most drivers would have pulled off for, and I had stayed on the road partly because I was good enough at it to manage it, and partly because stopping was not available to me as an option. Not practically, emotionally. I did not understand this about myself at the time. I understand it now. I had been up since 4:30. Gas station coffee in the thermos, half empty before we left the station. Full bus, 42 passengers. The specific mix of an early morning Greyhound run through Appalachia in winter. I know these runs. I have driven them for 11 years, and I can read a bus at a glance. Who is going to work? Who is going to family? Who is running from something? Who is going towards something they're not sure of yet? The man in work clothes near the front, the kind of man who has been making this commute to Knoxville for longer than he expected to when he started it. The family in the back, mother and father and 2 young children, the 5-year-old already restless, the 7-year-old with a toy pressed against the window watching the dark outside. 3 college students with headphones, the specific posture of people who have been visiting home for the break and are returning to their actual lives. The older woman in the window seat who had been asleep before we left the station, her head against the glass, the blue travel pillow around her neck. She looked like someone's grandmother. She was Ruth, though I didn't know her name then. She had been riding my route for 2 years for medical appointments in Knoxville, and I had never once had a real conversation with her. The young woman near the middle who had been crying quietly for the first 20 minutes of the ride and had then stopped, with the abruptness of someone who has decided they are done crying in public, even if they are not done with what is making them cry. I had noticed her and had not asked. That was not who I was then. 42 people on a Wednesday morning in January, going where they were going through whatever the mountain had for us. The weather report had said possible flurries above 3,000 feet. The weather report was conservative. By the time I reached the climb outside of Canton, the snow was coming horizontally, and the road was white. I'd driven it in worse, both hands on the wheel, speed down, eyes on the center line. This was the job, and in bad weather the job had its mercy. The required attention silenced everything else. For the duration of a mountain crossing in a storm, I didn't have to think about Marcus. The road was too demanding for anything else. In some terrible way, I had come to depend on that. At the rest area before the summit, a man was standing at the edge of the parking lot. I saw him from a distance as I slowed, a figure in the snow, not moving, standing without urgency, watching the bus approach. As I got closer, I could see the details. Thin coat, nowhere near enough for this temperature. A pack on one shoulder. No hat. Standing in the parking lot, not at the bus stop. He raised one hand as the bus passed. I didn't slow down. A woman 2 rows back said, "Driver, there was someone back there." I said, "I saw him." She said, "In this weather he..." I said, "Ma'am, I'm trying to drive in a snowstorm. I need you to let me do that." Silence. I pulled back onto the highway. I tell this part now with a specific kind of care. The man at that rest stop existed in a category I had already decided required nothing from me. The decision had been made before the situation arrived. I had organized my moral landscape efficiently enough that it didn't feel like a choice. I was thinking about the road ahead, and the weather, and the grade, and the people in my care. Not him. Never him. That's the honest account of who I was at that rest stop, and that is the person Jesus stopped the bus for. Not the person I would be after. Not the person who volunteers on Saturdays and keeps hand warmers in the luggage compartment. The person I was at 8:15 on a January Wednesday morning, who had driven past a man in a snowstorm and shut the door on a woman who was asking a reasonable question. That is who was on his knees in the snow 40 minutes later. I think about this when I'm tempted to make the story more flattering than it is. When I'm tempted to present myself as the kind of person who deserved to be found. I did not deserve to be found. I was the person at the rest stop. That's the honest account. And he found me anyway. The snow was worse at the summit. Visibility down to the length of my headlights. Wind pushing against the right side of the bus hard enough that I could feel the steering compensating. Focused. Both hands on the wheel, reading the road. Then the bus began to drift. A pulling to the right, the kind that happens on mountain roads when the surface beneath the tires isn't what it appears to be. I corrected. The bus corrected. Everything seemed fine for 40 seconds. Then it happened again, and this time the correction didn't hold. I felt the rear tires lose contact. In the next 4 seconds, I did everything 11 years on that route had taught me. Countersteer into the slide, brake gently, weight the front axle. Everything my body knew about controlling a large vehicle on a compromised surface. None of it was sufficient. The road curved right, and the bus was not curving with it. To the left was a guardrail. Beyond the guardrail was the mountain. Beyond the mountain was a 200-foot drop to the valley floor. I had driven past it 1,000 times in daylight, and I knew exactly what was down there. People were awake now, the children in the back crying. The father's voice, low and urgent. The college students, gripping their seats. The young woman who had been crying, pressed against the window with both hands, flat against the seat in front of her. The woman who had asked about the man at the rest stop said, "God," 1 syllable, direct, a prayer compressed to its minimum. I was steering with everything I had. The bus was sliding toward the guardrail at the speed of things that cannot be stopped by effort alone. And I prayed. Not formally, not with any structure. With the only words that existed in that second, which arrived not from intention but from somewhere deeper than intention. The place where the locked door had been for 3 years, which was now being pulled open from the inside because everything else had failed. God, please. God, please. God, please. 3 words repeating, because they were the only words left when I had used every other available resource and come to the end of them. The bus slid toward the guardrail. I want to be specific about what those seconds were like, because they matter. I had been in 2 combat deployments. I had been in a vehicle when an IED went off underneath it. I know what fear of dying feels like in the body. This was that, but with 42 other people in the bus behind me and the full weight of that responsibility on top of the fear, and I was running out of options in real time, and I knew it. God, please. God, please. God, please. I am not exaggerating when I tell you those were the only 3 words left. Not because I had consciously decided to pray, because every other word had been used, and those were what remained in the place underneath language where the most honest things live. 3 years of the closed door, and at the edge of a mountain with a bus full of people, the door came open from the inside. The bus slid toward the guardrail, and then a figure appeared in the road ahead. He was standing at the curve, in my lane, directly in the path of the bus, completely still in the snowstorm, thin coat, nowhere near enough for the temperature, pack on one shoulder, no hat, the man from the rest stop. I cannot explain how he was there. 2 miles of mountain highway, 4 minutes of drive time, a snowstorm that would have made that distance impossible on foot in that time. I have thought about this for 2 years, and I have nothing. I have stopped looking for an explanation that fits any framework I know. He raised one hand, the open palm gesture of someone extending something. He was standing at the curve. In my lane, directly in the path of the bus, completely still, thin coat, pack on one shoulder, no hat, the man from the rest stop. 2 miles of mountain highway between the rest area and this curve. I had driven that distance in 4 minutes. I cannot explain this. I have tried. I have thought about it for 2 years, and I have no explanation that satisfies me. I have stopped looking for one. He raised one hand. Not a stop gesture, not a wave. The open palm gesture of someone extending something. The bus stopped. Not the way buses stop when you apply the brakes. Not with the mechanical logic of deceleration. The slide arrested as though the physics had simply changed their mind. The vehicle came to rest, pointing diagonally across the lane, 8 feet from the guardrail, engine still running. Silence. The children were crying. The father was saying something under his breath. The woman in the second row had both hands pressed to her mouth. Several people were looking through the windshield at the man in the road. I opened the door. I don't remember deciding to open it. My body opened it, and I stepped down into the snow. The cold hit me. I stood in the road in the headlights in the January cold, and I looked at the man 10 feet in front of me. He was calm in the way that I still don't have words for. Not the calm of someone who doesn't understand what just happened. The calm of someone who understands it completely and is at peace with all of it. He said my name, not driver, not sir, my name, Daniel. Said with the quality of someone who has known a name for a long time and is using it now because it's right to use it. He said, I didn't stop this bus to save your life, Daniel. I stopped it because you asked me to, just now. For the first time in 3 years, I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it matters. I had just been afraid for my life, genuinely afraid, the specific animal fear of someone who can see exactly what's about to happen and cannot prevent it. That fear had been in my body 30 seconds before. Standing in front of this man, there was no fear. What there was instead was exposure. The specific vulnerability of someone who has been seen accurately, not evaluated, seen. There is a difference. Evaluation assigns a verdict. Being seen just means all of it is present simultaneously, without filtering, without the management I had been doing for 3 years to keep the difficult parts at a manageable distance. Every argument I had made to myself for 3 years. Every justification I had built. The rest stop, and the woman who said I should stop, and the way I said, Ma'am, I'm trying to drive in a snowstorm. The bottle in the kitchen. The apartment at 11 o'clock with the television on, and the specific mechanism that kept the door at 11 o'clock from fully arriving. The 3 years of not praying to someone who took my son, all of it visible, not condemned, just present, fully present, and on the face of the man I was looking at, not judgment, not accusation, not the righteous anger I had expected from God if I ever stopped avoiding him long enough to encounter him. Something else entirely. I would call it grief, not for what I had done, for what the 3 years had cost me. The specific sadness of someone who has watched a person they love suffer unnecessarily and who could not intervene because the person had the door locked from their side. That is what I saw in his face, and it was more devastating than any accusation would have been. I said Marcus's name. He said, "I know Marcus. I have always known him." He let that land. Then he said, "And I have been here with you the whole time, every mile of this road, every night in that apartment, every time you opened the bottle because it was the only thing that stopped the sound of that door at 11 o'clock. I was there. You just couldn't see me. I need to stop here and ask you something directly. Whatever you are carrying right now, whatever the locked room is in your life, leave a name in the comments below. Just one name. Someone you love who needs God right now. I will pray for every single one. I am a veteran. I did 2 tours in Iraq. I am not someone who cries in front of people. I am not someone who breaks down on command. I went to my knees in the snow. I am going to tell you what happened next plainly, because plainness is the only thing I have available and the only thing this deserves. The cold through my trousers. The snow still coming down. The sound of the bus behind me with 42 people inside. I cried in the way that a man cries when what's being cried about is not just present grief, but accumulated grief. Years of it, all of it releasing at the same time. Not from sadness exactly, from the specific unbearable relief of being found. I cried for Marcus, for Karen, for the man I had been for 3 years, the one who had decided the anger was manageable, and the drinking was manageable, and the closed door was the right response. I cried for the man at the rest stop that I had driven past in the snow. I want to be specific about what this kind of crying feels like, because it is different from ordinary grief. 3 years of ordinary grief had produced ordinary grief crying, controlled, brief, the kind you can do in a car or a bathroom and then push back down and continue with your day. This was not that. This was more like something structural giving way. Like a wall that has been taking pressure for a long time and has finally reached the point where it cannot take any more, and everything behind it releases at once. The weight of it was physical. My shoulders were shaking. I couldn't have stopped it if I had tried, and I didn't try. I have been in situations that required everything I had. 2 combat deployments, an IED blast, 11 years of mountain routes in all weather. I know what it costs to give everything you have. The thing I gave in that moment was the door itself. The thing I had been holding shut for 3 years with everything I had. I let go of it. Not because I had decided to. Because I had used up the last of the energy that was keeping it closed. When I lifted my face, the man in the road was not there. The snow continued. The bus idled. The road was empty ahead. I got back on the bus. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment before sitting down. 42 people were looking at me. The children in the back were quiet now, both held by their parents. The college students had their headphones around their necks. The older woman who had been asleep was wide awake. The young woman who had been crying in the first 20 minutes had both hands pressed against the seat in front of her, and she was looking at me with the expression of someone who is trying to understand what they just witnessed. I sat down. I took a breath, got on the intercom, said, "Is everybody okay back there?" Heard the kids' voices, steadier now. Called the highway crew and waited. When they asked me later about the mechanical failure, I said the steering had recovered and I couldn't account for the slide. When they asked about the stopping, I said I had brought it under control. When they asked about the man in the road, I said I had seen a figure and couldn't confirm details in the weather conditions. All technically true, but I didn't know at the time how to say what had actually happened in a language that an incident report had categories for. One of the passengers on that bus was a woman named Ruth. She rides my route every few weeks for medical appointments in Knoxville. She always tries to get a seat in the first few rows. I asked her once why. She said, "Your face. You have the most peaceful face she's ever seen on a man who works hard for a living." She said most bus drivers look like they're somewhere else. I look like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She told me later she had been on the bus that morning. She was the one in the second row who had asked about the man at the rest stop. She saw me through the windshield when I got off the bus. She watched me go to my knees. She said, I have wondered about that morning for 2 years. Now, I understand. In the weeks after the mountain, I made 2 calls. The first was to Karen. I waited 3 weeks, not because I was uncertain, but because I needed to understand what I was going to say before I said it. I told her everything, the rest area, the slide, the prayer I hadn't intended to pray, the words that came out because they were the only words left, the man in the road, what he said, my knees in the snow. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she said, "Daniel, I have been praying for you every single day since I left. Every single day. Not for the marriage, not for what I wanted, for you. That you would find your way back to something true." I said, "I know. I always knew you were. I could feel it, even through the wall. I just couldn't receive it." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because receiving it would have meant acknowledging that what I was doing wasn't working. And I wasn't ready to acknowledge that until the bus was going toward the mountain and I had nothing left." She was quiet for a moment. "Not for us. Not for what I wanted. For you. That you would find your way back to something." I said, "I know. I always knew you were. I just couldn't receive it." She said, "Can you now?" I said, "I went to my knees on a mountain road in January, and the first thing he said was Marcus's name. Yes, I can receive it now." We talked for 3 hours that night, about Marcus, the way we hadn't been able to talk about him in the months after the funeral, when the grief was too new and too raw. We talked about who he was, the laugh that filled rooms, the guitar, the questions he asked that deserved better answers than the adults around him usually had. We talked about Marcus like 2 people who loved the same person and were finally, after a long time of being too sad to speak, finding words for the love again. The second call was to a veterans services organization in Asheville. They run a transitional housing program and a day center for homeless and at-risk veterans. I had driven past their building on Merriman Avenue probably 100 times. I had thought about stopping. I had not stopped. I stopped. I volunteer there 2 Saturdays a month, not answering phones or handling paperwork, though they need that too. I drive men to their VA appointments and their hearings and their follow-up visits on my days off. I know the Asheville VA system now better than most of the men who use it, because I've navigated it with them enough times to know its geography, its specific frustrations, the particular language you need to speak to get things done in it. I also just sit with them sometimes. That's the part nobody tells you about volunteering. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is be in the room. Some of these men haven't had someone just sit with them in a long time. I understand that. I know what it's like to be a man who is technically functioning and is still, in some fundamental way, completely alone. I was that man for 3 years. I know what it costs. I know what it looks like from the inside. And I know what it felt like when something sat with me in it at a mountain rest stop in the snow, and then met me at the curve, and then said my son's name. That is why I volunteer. Not because I am a generous person. Because I know what it is to be found when you had stopped expecting it. I volunteer there 2 Saturdays a month. About 8 months after the mountain, I was driving the return run from Knoxville on a Wednesday evening. Late October, cold, but not yet winter. At a rest stop in Tennessee, I saw a man sitting on the ground near the picnic tables with a pack between his legs. Army jacket, the worn quality of a jacket that has been slept in. Maybe 45 years old. I pulled into the rest stop. I got out and walked over. I said, "You need a ride?" He looked at me. He said, "I can't pay." I said, "I didn't ask if you could pay." I brought him onto the bus, drove him to Asheville, walked him through the door of the Veterans Center, and introduced him to the director. I said, "This is a friend of mine. He needs somewhere to sleep tonight." She got him a bed. I found out later he was a Desert Storm veteran who had been cycling in and out of housing for 12 years. The night I brought him off the bus was the first night in 4 years he had slept indoors. He has an apartment now, a part-time job. a tentative relationship with his brother being rebuilt, slowly. The director told me what turned things for him was the specific moment when a bus driver he didn't know pulled into a rest stop and asked if he needed a ride, without asking first if he had money. He said, "That man treated me like I was worth something. I hadn't felt that in a long time. I keep a bag in my luggage compartment now. Dry socks, protein bars, hand warmers, and a laminated card with phone numbers for shelters and crisis services in every major city on the route. I update it when the numbers change. I look differently at the shoulders of the roads now, at rest stops, at the figures standing near the edge of parking lots in weather that is not kind to people without shelter. I see them differently than I did, not as a category, as people who had a road at some point that looked like mine and took a different turn, or had the turn taken for them. Most of them did not choose this. Most of them had something happen that they couldn't get back from alone. I know about not being able to get back from something alone, because I know who was standing at a rest stop in the snow when I drove past. I know what I did, and I know what he did 40 minutes later on the curve. He treated me like I was worth something when I had just demonstrated exactly who I was at my worst. That is who Jesus is. That is who he was on the mountain. And that is who he is right now for whoever is watching this and has been behind the same closed door I was behind. Every winter, on the anniversary of the mountain, I drive to that rest area on my day off, not in the bus, in my own car, on my own time. I don't tell anyone I'm going. I just go. I park in the same lot where the man was standing when I drove past. I get out and stand at the edge of it for a few minutes in whatever weather is there. I have stood there in clear cold, and in rain, and in fog. Last January there was snow, a light, steady fall. I stood with my face up and my eyes closed. There's nothing dramatic about it. No voice, no apparition, no visible sign. Just a man standing in a rest area in the snow, saying a prayer. My own car. I park, and I get out, and I stand at the edge of the lot for a few minutes in whatever weather is there. Last January there was snow, a light, steady fall. I stood in it with my face up and my eyes closed. The prayer I say is not long. I say it the same way every time. I say thank you for Marcus, who I will see again, for the mountain, which you let me drive past 11 years, so I would know exactly what was at the bottom when the bus started to slide, for the 3 years of the closed door, which you kept open on your side the whole time, for Karen's prayers that I couldn't receive until I had nothing left to stop me, for the man in the road, for coming back when I finally asked. I open my eyes. I get in my car. I drive back to Asheville. Karen still prays for me every day. We're not back together. The roads we took after Marcus diverged too far for that. But she is my family. She is Marcus's mother. She is the person who prayed for me for 3 years while I was behind a closed door, and that is permanent. We've been to Marcus's grave together on the anniversary and on his birthday, and once on a random Tuesday in September when neither of us could say why, except that we needed to be there. And we sat there and talked about who he was, and that is something I could not have done 3 years ago. That is the miracle I think about more than the bus. I want to say one final thing, for anyone watching this who has been running the same argument I was running. The door is not locked from the outside. That's what I got wrong for 3 years. I thought it was locked from the outside. I thought I had grounds. I thought my refusal was justified. And the whole time the lock was on my side. Jesus showed up for me when I had just done something I'm not proud of. I drove past a man in the snow who needed help, and I justified it to myself with the story I was carrying. And 20 minutes later, when the bus was going toward the mountain, that same man was standing in the road. He came to where I was. He stopped what I couldn't stop. And the first thing he said wasn't about what I had done at the rest stop. It was Marcus's name. He was not waiting for me to deserve it. He had been standing in the road the whole time. One word in the comments, road. Let me see where this reaches today. And if you're in that apartment right now, alone, running on whatever your mechanism is, with the door pushed shut and 3 years of reasons for keeping it that way, hear this from a bus driver in Western North Carolina. He is faster than the bus. He will meet you at the curve. I want to say something to the veterans watching this. I know some of you are in that apartment. Maybe not literally. Maybe it's a house. Maybe it's a truck cab. Maybe it's a different geography. But you know the apartment, I mean. The place where you landed after the service and you're running on whatever your mechanism is, and the door is shut, and you've got reasons for keeping it shut that make complete sense from the inside. I want to tell you something about those reasons. I thought the door was locked from the outside. I thought I had grounds. God had taken my son. My refusal was justified. The anger was righteous, and the distance was the correct response to what had been done to me. I was wrong. I know that now. Not because someone argued me out of it. Because a man appeared at a rest stop in a snowstorm, and I drove past him. And 40 minutes later, when the bus was going toward the mountain, he was standing in the road, and after the bus stopped, he said my name. What he said to me on that mountain road was not a theological argument. It was not a rebuttal to my 3 years of reasons. It was my son's name, said with the specific knowledge of someone who had always known him and had been present for all of it, including the nights I couldn't stop the sound of the door at 11 o'clock. The argument I'd been running for 3 years could not absorb that. If you're running your own version of that argument, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. I'm going to tell you what happened to me when I ran out of road. He was already there at the curve. He had been there the whole time. Karen prayed for me every day for 3 years while I was behind the door. Every single day. And the prayer that seemed to go nowhere was going somewhere. And on a January morning it arrived at a rest stop in a snowstorm, and I drove past it, and 40 minutes later the bus stopped, and I went to my knees in the snow. That's what 3 years of someone's prayers looks like when they finally land. If you have someone praying for you, and I believe most of you do, whether you know it or not, let this be the thing that tells you those prayers are going somewhere. The door is on your side. Road. There are a few things I'm asked regularly when I tell this story, and I want to address them honestly. People ask, "Are you sure you didn't imagine it? You were under extreme stress. You were sleep deprived. You were grieving. The brain does unusual things under those conditions." I've thought about this seriously, because I was trained to think seriously about the reliability of information under pressure. Here is my honest assessment. The man at the rest stop was real. 42 passengers were on the bus, and the woman in the second row asked me about him. He was there. The bus stopping in the way it stopped, at the point it stopped, is something I cannot account for mechanically. The highway crew documented the road conditions. They cannot account for it either. The man at the curve, 2 miles from where I passed him, 4 minutes after I passed him, in a snowstorm, I have no explanation. I have accepted that I have no explanation. What he said. My name. Marcus. I was there the whole time. I have reported this as accurately as I am able. What happened to me on my knees in the snow, the specific release of 3 years of something held too long, I was there for that. I know what it was. I'm not asking you to take my word for it on the theology. I'm asking you to consider what I know, that a man who had not prayed in 3 years prayed 3 words on a mountain, and the bus stopped. And 2 years later, he is still living differently because of what happened in the next 5 minutes. That is the account. You draw your own conclusion. Mine was drawn on my knees in the snow on a mountain in North Carolina, and I have been living in it since. People also ask, what about Marcus? Do you believe you'll see him again? Yes. That is the short answer. That is also the answer that took 3 years and a mountain to arrive at. I do not know the full architecture of what comes after. I am not a theologian. I am a bus driver from Western North Carolina who went to his knees in a snowstorm and had a conversation that reorganized the furniture of everything I had believed for 3 years. What I know is that the man who said, "I know Marcus and I have always known him," was not telling me Marcus was a distant concept or a theological category. He was telling me he knows my son, specifically. The way you know someone you have always known. I hold on to that. Every mile of the mountain route, I hold on to that. Road. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Karen last spring that I have been thinking about since. We had gone to Marcus's grave on his birthday. We go together every year now. It was a clear morning in May, warm enough that you could sit outside, and after we left the cemetery, we drove to a diner nearby and had breakfast. The kind of breakfast that takes 2 hours because neither person wants to be the one who ends it. She asked me what I wish I had done differently. Not about the marriage, not about the 3 years, specifically about the moment. The door. She asked, "When did you know the door was on your side?" I thought about it for a long time. I said, "I think I knew it at the rest stop. When I passed that man in the snow and didn't stop. I knew in the moment that what I was doing was wrong. Not theologically wrong. I didn't have theology anymore. Humanly wrong. The kind of wrong you feel before you have language for it." She said, "But you didn't stop." I said, "No, because the wrong was easier than the alternative." She asked, "What was the alternative?" I said, "The alternative was stopping, getting out in the snow, talking to a man I had decided I didn't have to see as a person. And all of that was going to cost me something. It was going to cost me the story I had built about those kinds of men being the face of what took Marcus. If I stopped for one of them, I was admitting the story was wrong. And I wasn't ready to do that yet." She looked at me. She said, "So what changed on the mountain?" I said, "I ran out of options. The bus was going toward the guardrail, and I had used everything I had and there was nothing left, and 3 words came out that I hadn't planned to say." She said, "Do you think that's what it takes, running out of options?" I thought about this. Then I said, "I think it takes whatever it takes. For some people, it's less dramatic. For me, it took a mountain." She smiled in the specific way Karen smiles when something is both sad and exactly right. Then she reached across the table and took my hand, the way she does sometimes without explanation. We finished breakfast. I drove her home. On the way back through Asheville, I passed the Veterans Center on Merriman Avenue. The lights were on inside. I could see the shape of people moving around through the glass. I thought about that man at the rest stop in Tennessee, about the apartment he has now, about the brother he is slowly rebuilding something with, about the Tuesday morning when a bus driver he didn't know pulled into a rest stop and asked if he needed a ride without asking first if he had money. I thought, that is all it was. A question asked without conditions. That is the entire account of what changed that man's trajectory. And I thought, the question without conditions is what was asked of me on the mountain, not what had I done or who was I or did I deserve it. Just, Daniel. I stopped it because you asked me to. Just now. For the first time in 3 years. That is the whole of it. That is the testimony I have to give. The mountain route is still the same route. The weather still comes in without warning. The grades are the same, and the curves are the same, and the mile markers are the same. Every January I drive past the rest area where the man was standing, and every January I slow down a little when I pass it, and I say something that is not quite a prayer but is in the direction of one. I say, I see it now. That's all. I see it now. Road. One last thing before I'm done. For the person who was in the position I was in at that rest stop, not in a bus, not on a mountain, the one who is passing someone right now, not literally, not in your car. In the larger sense, you know who I mean. The person you have decided exists in a category that requires nothing from you. The family member you've stopped calling. The friend you have written off. The colleague you look through. The person at the edge of the parking lot whose raised hand you are driving past, because the story you have built makes it easier not to stop. I am not telling you you're wrong about all of it. Some of what you've built the story from is real. The hurt is real. The reasons have weight. I am telling you what I know from the mountain. The man I drove past in the snow was the same man who stopped my bus at the curve. He did not stop my bus because I had been good. He stopped it because I asked him to with the last 3 words I had when everything else ran out. He was not waiting for me to deserve the stopping. He was not tracking my record. He was standing in the road the whole time with his hand up. If you're running on empty right now, if you've got nothing left but 3 words, if the door has been shut long enough that you've forgotten you're the one holding it shut, say the 3 words. He's at the curve. Road. I drive the mountain route still. Every week, same stretch of I-40, same grades and curves and mile markers. I've passed the rest area before the summit approximately 500 times in the 2 years since January. Every time I slow down a little. Not much. I have a schedule. I have passengers. The mountain does not care about my interior life. But enough. I look at the edge of the parking lot where he was standing. Sometimes there's someone there. Last November there was a man in a work jacket standing near the entrance, pack on one shoulder, not at the bus stop. I pulled in. I asked if he needed a ride. He said yes. I drove him to Knoxville. He was quiet the whole way. Didn't ask me anything. Didn't tell me anything. When he got off in Knoxville, he said thank you, and nodded and walked toward the terminal. I don't know his story. I don't know where he was going or why he was at that rest stop in November. I don't know if my stopping made a difference in any way that I could measure. I know what it felt like to drive past that kind of man for 3 years. I know what it felt like to drive past the one who mattered most. And I know what it felt like when the bus stopped at the curve and someone used my name. That's enough. Road. May Jesus walk with you today and in every day that is still ahead of you. Amen.